The door to Luminous Designs didn't just close, it sealed. It was a heavy, floor-to-ceiling slab of reinforced glass that met its frame with a pressurized thump, instantly severing the connection to the humid, cacophonous streets of Seoul's high-end Gangnam district. Inside, the world was different. The air was exactly 21 degrees Celsius, filtered to a purity that felt thin in the lungs, carrying the faint, expensive scent of white tea and beeswax polish. The silence here wasn't empty. It was a physical weight. It was the kind of silence that only exists in places where the carpet is thick enough to swallow a footfall and the walls are lined with sound-dampening velvet the color of a midnight sky. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Minho Park stood in the center of the showroom, his reflection caught in a dozen different polished surfaces. At 38, he moved with the predatory stillness of a man who had spent the last decade winning wars that were fought with spreadsheets instead of bayonets. His suit was charcoal gray, bespoke, structured with a sharpness that suggested it was less of a garment and more of a suit of armor. He didn't look at the cameras tucked into the molding. He knew they were there. And he knew they were currently scanning his face to cross-reference his net worth before a consultant even approached him. He wasn't here for a miracle. He was here to finalize a transaction. The 4-carat cushion cut, Minho said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that bypassed the need for a question mark. It was a command. He looked down into the glass display case. Resting on a pedestal of black silk was a diamond that looked like a trapped star. To anyone else, it was a symbol of eternal devotion. To Minho, it was the final signature on a merger. His fiancée, the daughter of a logistics titan, expected a specific tier of excellence. This ring would satisfy the optics. It would look perfect in the press release. It was a flawless asset for a flawless life. "It has exceptional clarity, sir," a voice began. But Minho wasn't listening to the specs. He knew the specs. He had memorized the GIA report before he even stepped out of his car. He leaned in closer, his eyes tracking the way the overhead LED spotlights shattered against the diamond's facets. He thought about the weight of it. It was heavy. He liked things that had weight. Contracts, gold bars, the heavy oak doors of a boardroom. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the glass, and for a fleeting second, he felt a strange, phantom itch in his chest, a sudden, irrational memory of a small, silver band he'd bought for $300 in a shop that smelled like fried oil and rain. He blinked the thought away. Sentiment is a luxury for those who can't afford the truth, his father had once told him. "I'll take it," Minho said, straightening his posture. "Wrap it in the signature blue box. I have a dinner at 8. "Of course, Mr. Park. If you'll just step to the counter, our lead designer will finalize the setting options with you." Minho turned. He moved with the effortless confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He reached the mahogany counter, pulling his black titanium credit card from a slim leather case. He didn't look up immediately. He was checking a notification on his watch, a projected dip in the Nikkei index. "Welcome to Luminous Designs," a woman's voice said. It wasn't the voice of the sales consultant. It was a voice that sounded like a ghost. It was a voice that belonged to a version of Minho that had died 12 years ago in a monsoon rain. Minho's hand froze over the counter. The air in the room, previously so perfectly regulated, suddenly felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. He felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, very slowly, as if his neck were made of rusted iron. He raised his head. Standing behind the counter was Jeon Kim. The world didn't just slow down, it fractured. She was dressed in a simple, high-collared black dress, a tailored blazer resting over her shoulders. Her hair, once a wild, ink-black mane that she used to tie back with whatever ribbon or scrap of cloth she could find, was now a disciplined, sophisticated bob that grazed her jawline. But the eyes, those deep, observant eyes that saw everything he tried to hide, were exactly the same. The silence between them stretched, vibrating like a piano wire pulled to the snapping point. Minho felt a bead of sweat track a slow, agonizing path down the small of his back. His pulse, usually a steady, mechanical 60 beats per minute, was suddenly a frantic drum in his ears. He looked at her, and for a second, he wasn't a CEO. He was a 26-year-old boy with a damp resume and a heart full of hollow promises. "Minho," she said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of a crime. She looked at the velvet box in his hand. She looked at the diamond he was buying for a woman whose name she didn't know, for a life she wasn't a part of. A flicker of something disgust, pity, passed over her face before it was buried under a professional mask so cold it rivaled his own. "Gian," he tried to say, but his voice was a dry rasp. He cleared his throat, trying to regain the force of nature persona that had served him so well. I didn't know you were here. I've been here for 3 years," she said, her voice devoid of any inflection. She reached for the tray, her fingers clean now, no charcoal stains, no ink moving with a terrifying, clinical grace. "You're looking for an engagement ring." "A wise choice. This particular cut is very popular with people in your position." The word position felt like a slur, but then the air shifted again. From beneath the counter, a small sound emerged, the soft scritch, scritch, scritch of a pencil against paper. Minho's eyes drifted downward. There, sitting on a small stool tucked into the corner of the designer's station, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She was wearing a denim jumper and a white turtleneck, her dark hair pulled into a neat, low ponytail. She didn't look up at first. She was staring at a sketchbook with a frighteningly intense focus. Minho watched her. He watched the way her small, delicate brow furrowed in concentration. And then, his heart stopped. The girl paused. She tilted her head to the left, exactly 30 degrees. Then, she raised her left hand and began to rhythmically tap the end of her pencil against the center of her chin. Tap, tap, tap. It was the exact habit Minho had when he was analyzing a stock's volatility. It was the habit his own mother used to tease him about when he was a child. It was a genetic signature, written in the air of a jewelry store he had no business being in. The girl looked up. Her eyes weren't Jian's. They were dark, piercing, and analytical. They were his. She looked at Minho, not with the fear children usually show toward powerful men, but with a quiet, unsettling curiosity. "Aoma," the girl whispered, her voice cutting through the artificial silence like a blade. "Who is that man? Why is he looking at me like he's seen a ghost?" Jian's hand moved instinctively to the child's shoulder. It wasn't just a touch. It was a shield. She pulled the girl closer, her knuckles turning white against the child's denim sleeve. "He's a customer, Suman," Jian said, her eyes locked on Minho's face, daring him to speak, daring him to breathe. Just an old acquaintance who lost his way. Minho looked from the woman who knew his soul to the child who carried his blood, and then down at the 4-carat diamond in his hand. The ring meant for his future suddenly felt like a handful of broken glass. In that moment, the CEO of the year realized that every deal he had ever closed was a loss. He had built an empire, but he had forgotten to check the foundation. And now, the past wasn't just catching up to him. It was staring him in the face, tapping a pencil against its chin, and asking for an explanation he didn't have. Before we reveal the secret Jian has kept for 7 years, I have to ask, have you ever had a sliding doors moment where a single choice changed the entire trajectory of your life? If you've ever had a love you let slip away for the sake of your career, drop a in the comments. I want to see how many of us are living with the ghosts of our own ambitions. Next, we're going to travel back 12 years to the night this all began, long before the suits, the diamonds, and the lies. 12 years ago, Seoul didn't sparkle with the polished, digital perfection it wears today. In the summer of 2014, the city felt like a giant, overheating engine, fueled by caffeine, desperation, and the relentless pressure to climb. It was a city of vertical hierarchies, where you were either the hammer or the nail. The monsoon that year was particularly brutal. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was an assault. The sky over the Han River was the color of a bruised lung, heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of ozone, wet concrete, and the sour, persistent tang of cheap SA cigarettes, smoked under shop awnings by men who had nowhere else to be. Minho Park was one of those men, though he would have died before admitting it. At 26, Minho didn't walk. He surged. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and caffeinated kinetic energy. But on this specific Tuesday in July, the force of nature was running out of breath. He stood under the leaking eaves of a skyscraper in Yeouido, the financial heart of the city, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest like a shield. Inside were the blueprints for a software platform that he believed would revolutionize the way small vendors managed logistics, a digital equalizer for the little guy. He had just come from the 17th floor. He had just received his 17th rejection. The investor, a man whose skin looked like expensive parchment, hadn't even looked at the demo. He had spent the entire 10-minute meeting looking at his gold Piaget watch. "The market belongs to the giants, Mr. Park," the man had said, his voice as dry as a desert wind. "Why would the world need a slingshot when it already has a nuclear deterrent? Come back when you've grown up." Minho stepped out into the downpour. He didn't have an umbrella. Umbrellas were for people who planned for the rain. Minho only planned for the win. Within seconds, his off-the-rack suit bought with the last of his savings was plastered to his frame. The wool felt like lead. The water soaked into his shoes, turning his socks into cold, squelching sponges. He started walking. He didn't have a destination. He just knew he couldn't stand still. If he stood still, the weight of his bank account balance, 42,001, barely enough for a week of ramen, would crush him. By the time he reached the winding, traditional alleys of Insadong, he was shivering. The grand skyscrapers of the financial district had given way to low-slung tea houses and paper lantern shops. He ducked into a place called the Moon's Shadow. It was a basement tea house, the air thick with the scent of roasted barley and damp wood. He found a table in the back, away from the three other patrons. He opened his briefcase with trembling hands. The top page of his pitch deck was ruined. The ink had bled, turning his meticulously graphed projections into a dark, Rorschach inkblot that looked like a monster's mouth. Minho stared at it. For the first time in his life, the fire in his gut flickered. He felt the cold of the rain finally reach his bones. He leaned his head into his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. "You're going to get the paper wet if you keep dripping like that." The voice was light, but it had a grounding quality, like a low cello note. Minho looked up. A woman was standing there. She wasn't wearing a waitress's apron. She was wearing an oversized denim shirt that was spotted with various shades of gray and black. In her left hand, she held a steaming ceramic cup. In her right, a thick sketchbook. "I didn't order anything," Minho said, his voice cracking. He tried to straighten his tie, but it was a sodden mess. "I didn't ask if you did," she replied. She slid the cup onto the table. "Ginger tea, with extra honey. You look like you're about to catch pneumonia, and that's a terrible way to spend a Tuesday." She didn't wait for a thank you. She sat down across from him, opening her sketchbook as if they were old friends who had simply forgotten to speak for a while. Minho stared at the tea. Then he looked at her. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by the standards of the Gangnam billboards. Her face was heart-shaped, her skin pale and dusted with a light smudge of charcoal on the cheekbone. But it was her hands that caught his eye. They were the hands of a worker. Her fingernails were short, and the cuticles were stained with deep, permanent lines of ink and graphite. There was a callus on the side of her middle finger from holding a pencil too tight. They were hands that built things. "I'm Jian," she said, not looking up from her page. She was sketching the old man in the corner, who was nodding off over a newspaper. "And you're the man who's trying to sell the future to people who only care about the past." Minho's eyes narrowed. "How do you know what I'm doing? You've been staring at those ruined papers for 10 minutes like they're the 10 Commandments," she said, finally looking at him. Her eyes were wide and unnervingly perceptive. "Software? Logistics? I saw the header before the ink ran. It's a platform for the independent merchants," Minho said, the pitch reflexively kicking in. "It levels the playing field against the Keebles, but nobody wants to hear it. They want more of the same. They want to play it safe." Jian leaned forward, resting her chin on her palm. "Maybe you're talking to the wrong people. You're talking to the architects of the fortress, asking them to give you the keys to the gate. Why would they say yes?" For the next 3 hours, the rain hammered against the small, high windows of the tea house. But Minho didn't hear it anymore. He talked about his childhood in a house where silence was a requirement, and success was the only currency. He talked about his dream of building something that actually mattered, something that wasn't just another cog in his father's machine. And Jian listened. She didn't just nod, she challenged. She asked about the shopkeepers in the alleys, the grandmothers selling peppers in the sun. She made him see the people behind the data points. You have a force of nature problem, Minho, she said, her ink-stained finger tracing the rim of her cup. You want to be the storm, but the storm just destroys. If you want to build a world, you have to be the soil. When the tea house closed, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. They walked through the damp streets of Insadong, the yellow glow of the streetlights reflecting in the puddles. Minho felt lighter than he had in years. The 17 rejections didn't feel like failures anymore. They felt like filters. He walked her to the gate of her small, crumbling apartment building. Will I see you again? He asked, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that had nothing to do with business. Jian smiled. It was a small, knowing expression. That depends. Are you going to keep being a storm, or are you going to start being a man? They were married 14 months later. The wedding was held in a sterile, white-walled hall in a hotel owned by one of Minho's father's associates. It was a strategic venue. To Minho's parents, the event wasn't a union of souls. It was a PR disaster they were trying to mitigate. Minho stood at the altar in a tuxedo that felt like a straitjacket. Across the aisle, his father, Park Sun-hyuk, sat with his arms crossed, his face a mask of disappointment. Beside him, Minho's mother adjusted her pearls, her eyes fixed on the back of Jian's head with a coldness that could have frozen the champagne. She will be the anchor that drowns you, his father had hissed in the dressing room moments before the ceremony. A painter with no lineage and no dowry. You are throwing away a century of progress for a feeling. You'll regret this when the bills come due. But then, the doors opened. Jian walked down the aisle, and the room seemed to regain its color. She had designed her own dress, a simple, elegant silk gown that didn't need lace or sequins to command the room. She carried a bouquet of wild lilies. Her hands were clean for the ceremony, but Minho knew that if he looked closely, he'd still see the faint ghost of charcoal under her nails. When they exchanged rings, Minho's hand didn't shake. He looked past his parents, past the judgment of the high society guests, and looked into Jian's eyes. I will build a world for you, he whispered, so low, only she could hear. Don't build it for me, she whispered back. Build it with me. The reception was a nightmare of polite insults and frozen smiles. Minho's mother spent the evening pointedly asking Jian which prestigious European academy she had attended, only to offer a tight, pitying smile when Jian mentioned her local arts college. But as soon as the last guest left, the noir reality of their new life began. They didn't go to a honeymoon suite at the Shilla. They took a taxi to a tiny, third-floor walk-up in Mapogu. The apartment was so small that if you stood in the center and turned in a circle, you could touch every wall. The air smelled of turpentine and old wood. Jian's canvases were stacked in the corners, and Minho's 2 computer monitors dominated the kitchen table. It was sweltering. The old air conditioner in the window rattled like a bag of nails, blowing air that was only slightly cooler than the humid night outside. It's not a palace, Minho said, dropping their bags on the floor. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt. He had taken her from her world and brought her into this, a struggle he wasn't sure he could win. Jian didn't complain. She kicked off her heels, the silk of her wedding dress rustling against the worn linoleum. She walked over to the kitchen table, picked up a pen, and handed it to him. You have work to do, she said. Minho looked at her, confused. It's our wedding night. Exactly, she said, leaning against the counter. Our wedding night is the first night of the new world. I'll start on the sketches for the user interface. You finish the back-end code. We have a meeting with the tech hub director on Monday. She went to the fridge, pulled out 2 cold cans of Cass beer, and handed him one. To the soil, she said, clinking her can against his. To the soil, he replied. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat side by side at that cramped kitchen table, the heat of the city pressing in through the open window. Minho's fingers flew across the keyboard, the green lines of code reflecting in his glasses. Beside him, Jian's pencil scratched rhythmically against her sketchbook, her charcoal-stained fingers creating the visual language of his dreams. Every time Minho felt his energy flag, he would feel her hand on his shoulder. A gentle squeeze. The scent of her ginger tea and oil paint acted like a drug, sharpening his focus, pushing him further. In that tiny, hot apartment. They were invincible. They were a closed loop, a two-person army. They didn't need the hotel ballroom or the approval of the Park family. They had the force of nature and the soul of the soil. Minho looked at Jian in the dim light of the computer screen. She was focused, a smudge of lead already appearing on her cheek. He truly believed, in that moment, that as long as she was there, he could never lose. He didn't realize that the very ambition he was using to build their future was already starting to craft the walls that would eventually keep her out. He was building the architecture of ambition, and he was so focused on the height of the towers that he forgot to check if the windows were meant to let the light in or just to look down on everyone else. This story is long and dark, a journey from the heat of a Mapo-gu kitchen to the cold glass of a Gangnam boutique. What time is it where you are watching this from? Are you chasing a dream late into the night, or is the sun just coming up on your own? Architecture of ambition? Let me know in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. In the upper echelons of the Korean business world, power isn't just about money, it's about the conglomerate soul. It's a belief system that dictates that the individual is nothing and the organization is everything. To the men who sat in the high-backed leather chairs of the Hansung Group boardrooms, emotions weren't human traits, they were line-item expenses. They were liabilities that needed to be hedged or liquidated. Minho's primary antagonist wasn't a rival CEO or a corporate spy. It was his own father, Park Sun-hyuk, and the cold, mechanical philosophy he represented. Sun-hyuk was a man who smelled of expensive starch and old-growth cedar. He didn't believe in building something that mattered. He believed in dominance. To him, Minho's startup was a hobby, a rebellious phase that would eventually end when the boy realized that the world didn't run on software. It ran on in-make, the intricate, often corrupt web of human connections and favors. "You're playing with toys, Minho," Sun-hyuk had told him during a mandatory Sunday lunch, his voice cutting through the clink of fine bone china. "You want to help independent merchants. You're trying to save the ants from the elephant's foot. The elephant doesn't even know it's stepping on them. It's not malice, it's physics." This was the machine Minho was fighting. A machine that viewed Jian not as a wife, but as a strategic error. A machine that viewed love as a friction point in the gears of progress. The first real win didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in that same cramped Mapo-gu apartment. But the air felt different that night. It was late October, and the heat of the monsoon had been replaced by a crisp, biting autumn wind that rattled the window pane. Minho sat at the kitchen table, the glow of his monitors casting a ghostly blue light across his face. For 72 hours, he had barely slept. He had been chasing a bug in the beta version of the platform, a glitch that threatened to tank their first pilot program with a group of 30 textile wholesalers. Jian was on the floor, surrounded by canvases, sketching the layout for a new branding campaign. She looked up, her eyes tired but bright. "You've been staring at that line of code for 2 hours, Minho. Drink some water." Minho didn't answer. His fingers were poised over the keyboard. And then, he saw it. The logic flaw. He deleted 3 lines, typed in a new variable, and hit Enter. The screen flickered. A progress bar zipped across the display, and then a notification popped up from their merchant dashboard. One of the wholesalers had just processed a transaction through the platform, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. "Jian," Minho whispered. "It's working." He stood up so fast his chair screeched against the linoleum. He pulled her up from the floor, spinning her around the tiny kitchen. They laughed, a raw, hysterical sound of pure relief. Minho reached for a bottle of champagne, the break glass in case of emergency bottle they'd bought with their last bit of grocery money months ago. He popped the cork, the foam spilling over his hands. He poured 2 mugs, full they didn't own flutes, and handed one to her. "To the future," Jian said, her eyes shining with a deep, soulful pride. "To the people we're going to help." Minho raised his mug. But as he looked at the screen, a new set of numbers began to scroll. It wasn't just the successful transactions. It was the commissions. The analytics showed a projected growth curve that defied his own optimistic spreadsheets. In that moment, a camera flash seemed to go off in his mind. He looked at Jian, and for a split second, he didn't see the woman who had sat in the rain with him. He saw a distraction. He looked back at the screen, And his eyes, the eyes that had once held a soft, desperate warmth, turned hard. They turned cold. They began to reflect the neon green of the profit margins. He didn't notice that he stopped drinking. He was already calculating the next move. "We need to raise the commission by 0.5%, he said, his voice flat, devoid of the joy he'd felt seconds ago. Jian paused, her mug halfway to her lips. "What?" "We agreed to keep it low to help them transition. The data says they'll pay it," Minho replied, not looking at her. 0.5% across 10,000 merchants is the difference between a startup and a conglomerate. If we want to beat my father, we can't be fair. We have to be essential." The champagne in the mugs was still bubbling, but the heat in the room had vanished. Jian looked at him, searching for the man who wanted to build something that mattered. He was still there, physically, but the force of nature had found a new direction. He wasn't fighting the elephant anymore. He was learning how to become one. 6 months later, the Mapogu apartment was gone, replaced by a sleek, glass-walled flat in a rising neighborhood. The furniture was minimal, expensive, and uncomfortable. The win had attracted a Tier 1 venture capital firm. Minho was no longer wearing off-the-rack suits. He was being measured for Italian wool. He had a car, now a black sedan that whispered as it moved through the city. They were driving home from a dinner with the lead investors. Jian sat in the passenger seat, her hands clasped in her lap. She was wearing a dress Minho had suggested she buy, a structured, neutral-toned piece that made her look like a corporate wife instead of an artist. "The meeting went well," Minho said, his thumb scrolling incessantly on his phone. Scroll, tap, scroll. The blue light reflected in the car's windshield. "Did you hear what Mr. Choi said about the gallery space?" Jian asked. Her voice was small, trying to find a gap in the digital noise. "He knows a landlord near the National Museum. He thinks I could finally put on a solo show by spring." Minho didn't look up. Tap, tap, delete. "That's great, Jian. Really. But we need to talk about the Singapore trip. Choi wants me there for the entire month of March. He thinks we can pivot the logistics model to handle international shipping." "Minho," she said, her voice firmer now. "I'm talking about my work. I haven't picked up a brush in 3 weeks because I've been helping your HR team with the new office branding. I need to tell you something. Something important about us." Minho's phone buzzed. "A high-priority email from the legal team." "Hold on," he said, his voice sharp. "I need to handle this. If the patent filing is delayed, we lose our lead on the Daewoo Group. Just give me 5 minutes." He didn't give her 5 minutes. He gave her the entire drive. The car glided through the neon-drenched streets of Seoul. Outside, the city was a blur of light and motion, a masterpiece of human ambition. Inside the car, the silence was absolute. It wasn't the comfortable silence they'd shared in the tea house. It was a pressurized silence, the kind that happens right before a deep-sea hull begins to crack. Jian looked out the window at her reflection. She looked like a stranger. She had been trying to tell him that she felt like she was disappearing. She had been trying to tell him that she was tired of being the soul of the soil, when the soil was being paved over with concrete. But most of all, she had been trying to tell him that she was late. 2 weeks late. She looked at Minho. He was illuminated by the cold light of his screen, his jaw set in a hard, determined line. He looked powerful. He looked successful. He looked like a man who had no room in his life for a variable he couldn't control. When they pulled into the underground parking garage of their building, the engine cut out, leaving only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Minho finally tucked his phone into his pocket. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Okay, what were you saying? Something about a gallery?" Jian stared at the concrete wall in front of them. The moment had passed. The window had closed. She could feel the conglomerate soul sitting in the driver's seat next to her. And she knew that if she told him now, he wouldn't see a child. He would see a complication. "Nothing," she said, her voice as cold as the air conditioning. It wasn't important. She opened the car door and stepped out, the click of her heels echoing in the empty garage like a countdown. Minho sat there for a moment, his hand drifting back toward his pocket. He felt a vague sense of unease, a flicker of the man he used to be. But then, his phone buzzed again. A notification, a new milestone, a higher number. The unease vanished. He stepped out of the car, straightened his Italian blazer, and followed her toward the elevator, already composing a reply to an investor he hadn't met yet. He was winning, and in the world of the conglomerate soul, That was the only thing that was allowed to be true. If you were in Jian's shoes sitting in that silent car, realizing the person you love has become a stranger, would you have spoken up, or would you have walked away? Comment, speak, or walk below. I want to see how you would handle the silence of success. By the time Minho Park was named CEO of the newly restructured Park Logistics Global, he had achieved the impossible. He had not only survived the elephant's foot, he had built a bigger elephant, but the view from the top wasn't the sun-drenched horizon he had imagined in the tea house. It was a cold, blue-tinted world of glass, steel, and a crushing, quiet paranoia. His new penthouse in Cheongdam-dong was a marvel of modern architecture. It was a cathedral of nothingness. The floors were polished white marble that reflected the city lights like a frozen lake. The furniture was all sharp edges and chrome, beautiful to look at but hostile to the human body. There were no charcoal smudges here, no half-finished canvases, no smell of ginger tea. The penthouse smelled of industrial ozone and Silver Mountain cologne, the scent of a man who was always moving, always calculating, and always alone. Minho had stopped sleeping. Not because he couldn't, but because sleep felt like a tactical vulnerability. He existed in a state of high-functioning exhaustion, sustained by double-shot espressos and the adrenaline of the next deal. He slept 4 hours a night, usually on the sofa in his office, his tie loosened but never removed. In the dead of night, the penthouse would come alive with the ghosts of his ambition. Every creak of the building's settling frame sounded like a footstep. Every flash of a distant police siren against the ceiling looked like a searchlight. He found himself checking the security monitors in the hallway 3-4 times a night. He wasn't looking for burglars. He was looking for a version of himself he might have dropped along the way. He began to see threats everywhere. His CFO's smile was a fraction too wide. Was he plotting a coup? The venture capitalists were asking for more frequent audits. Were they looking for a reason to replace him? Even the silence of the apartment felt like a trap. Jian had become a ghost in her own home. She moved through the marble halls like a shadow, her presence marked only by the absence of her voice. She had stopped trying to compete with the blue light of his phone. She had stopped asking about his day. She simply existed in the periphery of his empire, a legacy asset that he no longer knew how to maintain. The end didn't come with a bang. It came with the sound of a suitcase zipper, a jagged, metallic scream that tore through the silence of the penthouse on a Tuesday evening in late February. Minho had just returned from a 14-hour session with the board. He was energized, vibrating with the news he was about to deliver. He walked into the master bedroom, throwing his blazer onto the bed. "Singapore is a go," he said, not looking at Jian, who was standing by the closet. "The board approved the expansion. We move in 3 weeks. I've already looked at the corporate housing in Orchard Road. It's perfect. High security, integrated office suite, 34th floor." Jian didn't say anything. She was holding a stack of sweaters. She placed them carefully into an open suitcase on the floor. "Did you hear me?" Minho asked, his voice sharpening. "This is the big one, Jian. This makes us untouchable. My father's associates are already calling to ask for advice. I've won." Jian straightened up. She looked at him, and for the first time in months, her eyes weren't tired. They were clear. Piercingly. Terrifyingly clear. "You won, Minho," she said quietly. "But who is us?" Minho frowned. "What are you talking about? We're moving. Together." "No," she said. She reached down and pulled the zipper of the suitcase. Zzz. The sound felt final. It felt like the closing of a tomb. "I'm not going to Singapore," she continued. "I'm not going to the 34th floor of another glass box. I'm not going anywhere with the CEO of Park Logistics. This is an opportunity of a lifetime," Minho shouted, his force of nature persona erupting. "I am building an empire for our future. Do you have any idea what I've sacrificed to get us here? The nights without sleep, the deals, the politics. You sacrificed me, Minho." Jian's voice finally broke, the emotion flooding the room like a burst pipe. "You sacrificed the tea house. You sacrificed the man who cared about the merchants in the alley. You sacrificed the person who used to look at me like I was the only thing that mattered." She stepped toward him, her hand trembling. "Look at this room. It's a museum of things you don't use. You don't live here." You just occupy it between meetings. I've spent 3 years waiting for one more quarter. Well, the quarter is over, and I'm liquidated. Minho felt a surge of genuine, cold panic. Jian, listen to me. I'll slow down. Once the Singapore office is stabilized, you're lying, she said, and the simplicity of the statement hit him harder than a physical blow. You've forgotten how to tell the truth because you've spent too long selling projections. You don't want a wife. You want a placeholder. She picked up the suitcase. It was small, just the essentials. Where are you going? He demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low growl. You have nothing without me. My father was right. You're an artist with no lineage. How are you going to survive? Jian paused at the bedroom door. She looked back at him, and for a fleeting second, he saw the girl from the tea house again, the one with charcoal on her cheek and fire in her soul. I survived before you were. Someone worth seeing. Minho, she said. I think I'll manage. She walked out. He heard the front door, that heavy, reinforced slab of oak, click shut. No slam, just a click. Minho stood in the center of the white marble room. He expected to feel rage. He expected to feel a sense of betrayal. But as the silence of the penthouse settled back over him, he felt something far worse. He felt nothing. He walked over to his desk, picked up his phone, and opened his calendar. He had a 6 a.m. flight to Tokyo. He had a 9 a.m. breakfast with the Ministry of Trade. He had a 2 p.m. press conference. He sat down in his leather chair and began to work. He told himself it was for the best. He told himself that a man building an empire couldn't be weighed down by someone who didn't understand the cost of greatness. He was the CEO. He was the force of nature. And for the first time in his life, he was completely, utterly alone. Singapore was a triumph. The Singapore office was a gleaming spire of efficiency. Minho moved through the city-state like a machine. He became a fixture in the golden circle of international finance. He was the man who turned logistics into an art form, but his life was a sequence of voids. The car ride from the airport to the office, the silent meal in a Michelin-starred restaurant where he ate alone while reading market reports, the 34th floor balcony where he watched the ships in the harbor, their lights looking like the diamonds he would eventually buy to try and fill the hole in his chest. He became colder, more precise. He replaced his staff with people who didn't ask, "How are you?" but "What is the margin?" He was successful by every metric the world cared about. His net worth increased by 400%. His father finally called him son, with a note of genuine respect. He was the king of a glass mountain. But every now and then, usually around 3 a.m., when the air conditioning in his Singapore apartment hummed at a specific frequency, he would find himself looking at his left hand. He would remember the phantom itch of a $300 silver band. He would remember the smell of ginger tea, and he would wonder if the architecture of ambition was actually just a very expensive cage. This story is getting darker, and we are approaching the moment where Minho's past and future finally collide. What time is it where you are watching this from? Is it late enough for the ghosts to come out? Let me know in the comments. I'm here in the dark with you. The security chime at Luminous Designs was a low, melodic hum, designed to alert the staff without startling the clientele. Jian Kim didn't even look up at first. She was leaning over the velvet-lined display tray, adjusting the lighting on a new series of pear-cut earrings. Her world was now one of microns, clarity grades, and the quiet dignity of craftsmanship. Then, the air in the room changed. It was a subtle shift in pressure, the way the atmosphere tightens just before a lightning strike. She felt him before she saw him. It was a phantom ache in her marrow, a resonance she had spent 7 years trying to tune out. She raised her head, and the polished tweezers in her hand trembled just a fraction of a millimeter, but enough to drop a 2-carat stone onto the velvet. He was taller, or perhaps he just took up more space now. He looked like the man he had always threatened to become, a statue carved from granite and tailored wool. To the rest of the world, he was the apex predator of the logistics industry. To Jian, he was the man who had let her walk out of a penthouse without looking back. From her vantage point behind the counter, Jian felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. It wasn't fear for herself. She had found her footing long ago. It was fear for the small, dark-haired girl sitting 3 feet away at the designer's desk. Don't look at her, Jian thought. her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Look at the diamonds. Look at the invoice. Just don't look at the girl. Jian watched him through the security glass as he approached. He moved with a mechanical precision, his eyes scanning the room as if he were evaluating it for a hostile takeover. She saw him look at the cushion-cut diamond. She saw the way he dismissed the sales consultant. He was still the storm. He was just better at masking the thunder. As he reached the counter, Jian's mind became a battlefield. Does he know? The thought screamed in her head. She looked at Suman. The girl was oblivious, lost in her own world of architectural sketches. Suman was the living embodiment of everything Minho had claimed to want, but hadn't been willing to wait for. She was his analytical mind, tempered by Jian's empathy. She was a secret Jian had carried through 3 moves, 2 job changes, and 1,000 sleepless nights. The betrayal wasn't in the leaving. The betrayal was in the silence that followed. Jian remembered the morning she realized she was pregnant. She had been standing in a tiny, 1-room flat in a neighborhood where the trains ran so close the windows vibrated. She had picked up the phone to call him a dozen times, but then she would remember the sound of that suitcase zipper. She would remember him telling her she was nothing without his lineage. She had realized then that telling him wouldn't be sharing a joy. It would be surrendering an asset. He wouldn't have been a father. He would have been a stakeholder. He would have tried to optimize Suman's life, to enroll her in the right schools, to fulfill a legacy he had only just begun to build. She chose silence to keep Sumin human. But now, as he stood across the mahogany counter, the silence felt like a physical weight. She looked at his face. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the mouth more cynical. He looked successful, yes, but he looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. "Welcome to Luminous Designs," she said. The words felt like ash. Every second that passed without her saying, "Minho, this is your daughter," felt like a fresh betrayal. Yet, every second she kept the secret felt like an act of protection. She saw him notice Suman. She saw the moment the force of nature hit a wall. She watched him track Suman's movements, the tilt of the head, the tapping of the pencil. She saw the realization dawn on his face, a slow-motion car crash of emotion that shattered his corporate mask. He knows, she realized. He doesn't have proof, but the blood recognizes itself. Minho wasn't just here for a ring. He was here for Jiwan Han. While Jian was the soul of the soil, Jiwan was the gilding of the empire. Jian knew of her, of course. In the small, incestuous circles of Seoul's elite, Jiwan was a celebrity. She was the daughter of the Hanseo Logistics Group, a woman who didn't walk so much as she floated on a cloud of inherited prestige and finishing school grace. Jiwan was the perfect asset. She was a woman with no sharp edges, no charcoal under her nails, and no inconvenient dreams of her own. She was a woman who understood that a marriage was a strategic partnership, a consolidation of shipping lanes and warehouse territories. Jian looked at the ring Minho had selected. It was massive. It was flawless. It was also entirely impersonal. It was a ring for a woman who would wear it to charity galas and board dinners. A woman who would never ask Minho to choose love over ambition because she didn't believe in the distinction. The contrast was staggering. A $300 silver band, a cramped kitchen, and the smell of ginger tea. A life where the force of nature was fueled by a woman's belief in a man's soul. A 4-carat cushion cut, a Gangnam boutique, and the cold smell of ozone. A life where the CEO was fueled by a woman's proximity to a logistics empire. Jiwon Han didn't have a soul. She had a brand. She was the woman Minho's father had always wanted for him. She was the woman who would never notice the ghost in the penthouse because she was a ghost herself, a beautiful, silk-clad specter of social expectation. "Will your girlfriend like it?" Suman asked, her voice innocent and terrifyingly direct. Jian felt the air crystallize. She saw Minho flinch. It was the first time she had seen him show genuine pain in a decade. He looked at his child, and then at the ring, intended for the asset. The trap was finally sprung. Minho had walked into the boutique to finalize his future, only to find that he had left his life behind years ago. He was buying a diamond for a woman who didn't know him, sold to him by the only woman who ever did, while his own flesh and blood watched from the corner, calling him a stranger. The betrayal was complete. Not by Jian's hand, but by Minho's own choices. He had built the cage, and now, for the first time, he was seeing the bars. "I don't know," Minho whispered, staring at Suman. Jian felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a fierce, maternal territorialism. He had no right to this pain. He had bought it with every meeting he didn't cancel and every phone call he took while she sat in the passenger seat of his success. "The paperwork is ready, Mr. Park," Jian said, her voice a cold snap of reality. "Shall we finalize the transaction, or have you realized the price is too high?" She wasn't talking about the money, and by the look in Minho's eyes, he knew exactly what she meant. "This story is long and dark. What time is it where you are watching this from? Are you currently at a crossroads between your past and your future? Let me know in the comments below. I'm reading every one of them." The park was a humble patch of green squeezed between two towering, soot-stained apartment complexes. It was the kind of place the force of nature would have cleared for a distribution center 5 years ago. Here, the air didn't smell of white tea or ozone. It smelled of damp earth, wood chips, and the sugary scent of street vendor hottiok. Minho sat on a weathered wooden bench, his $6,000 suit jacket folded neatly beside him. He felt exposed. Without the glass walls of his office or the leather interior of his sedan, he was just a man sitting in the wind. 50 yards away, the sound of children screaming in play, high-pitched, chaotic, and full of life, created a jarring contrast to the heavy, tomb-like silence on the bench. Jian sat at the far end of the wood slats. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on Suman, who was standing perfectly still near the slide, watching the other children with the intensity of a diamond grater. "You're an hour early," Jian said. Her voice was flat, buffeted by the breeze. "I couldn't stay in the office," Minho replied. The walls felt like they were closing in. "That's the guilt, Minho. It has a way of shrinking a room." He turned to her, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you tell me, Jian? 7 years. I've lived an entire life since then. I've built things. I've traveled the world. And all that time, there was this." He gestured toward Suman. "My daughter was breathing the same air, and I didn't even know her name." Jian finally turned. Her eyes were red-rimmed but fierce. "You want to know why? Because I knew exactly what you would do. You would have turned her into a project. You would have hired a fleet of nannies and tutors. You would have tried to buy her a future before she even had a childhood. You were a man who saw people as variables to be optimized. I didn't want my daughter to be an optimized variable." The silence returned, deeper this time. A stray ball rolled toward Minho's polished shoes. He ignored it. "It wasn't easy, was it?" he asked softly. Jian let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Easy? You have no idea. After the divorce, after the generous settlement you signed off on without a second thought, things went south. I was high risk. I spent 3 months on bed rest in a room that was barely larger than your current walk-in closet. I watched my bank account dwindle to 4 figures while I listened to the news talk about your record-breaking IPO. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. The medical bills for the birth were just the start. When Suman was 3, I knew she was different. She didn't speak like the other kids. She wouldn't look people in the eye. She would sit for hours and arrange her blocks by the exact shade of the wood grain. Minho felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The specialists called it developmental divergence, Jian continued. High functioning, brilliant, but socially fragile. In this country, Minho, that's a stigma. It's an expensive stigma. I worked 3 jobs. I drew storyboards for commercials I hated. I designed cheap plastic jewelry for subway stalls just to pay for the therapists who could help her navigate a world that thinks she's broken because she's precise. I could have helped, Minho said, his voice thick with a mix of rage and shame. I have the resources. I have the best doctors in the world on my payroll. And that's exactly the point, Jian snapped. You would have tried to fix her. You would have seen her differences as a flaw in the code. You would have been ashamed of the daughter who couldn't stand the noise of your corporate galas. Minho looked back at Suman. She had moved away from the slide and was now sitting at a picnic table, her sketchbook open. She was drawing the shadows cast by the trees, not the trees themselves, but the intricate, negative spaces of the darkness on the ground. She isn't broken, Minho, Jian said, her voice softening as she watched the girl. She is the better version of you. Minho watched Suman's hands move. The precision was haunting. She had his mathematical brain, the one that could see patterns in chaos and logic in the noise. But as he watched her stop drawing to gently move a ladybug off her page, careful not to hurt it, Waiting patiently for it to crawl onto a leaf, he saw the difference. She had Jian's heart. She had the force of nature inside her, but it wasn't a storm of destruction. It was a light of observation. She was a genius who cared about the ladybug. She was a strategist who valued the soul of the soil. She was everything Minho had been before he'd let his father's world polish the humanity out of him. "She's magnificent," Minho whispered. "She is," Jian agreed. "And she is perfectly happy without a billionaire's name attached to her birth certificate. So I ask you again, Minho, why are you really here? Is this about her, or is this about your ego needing to own the one thing that got away?" Minho's phone vibrated in his pocket. It wasn't a text. It was the emergency override ringtone from his executive assistant. He pulled it out. The screen was lit up with notifications. "Board is assembled. Your father is asking why you aren't on the conference line. Ji-won is at the office. She's asking about the ring." This was the moment. This was the flashpoint he had worked for since he was 26 years old. If he walked to his car right now, he could make it to the office in 40 minutes. He would sign the papers, solidify the merger with the Han family, and become the undisputed king of logistics in East Asia. He would satisfy his father. He would marry the perfect asset. He would finally be untouchable. If he stayed, he would be late. The board would see it as a sign of weakness. The Han family, obsessed with punctuality and protocol, would likely pull the deal. His father would never forgive him. The architecture of ambition he had spent 12 years building would suffer its first major structural crack. He looked at the phone. The blue light reflected in his eyes the same cold light that had once replaced the warmth of the tea house. Then, he looked at Suman. The girl had finished her drawing. She looked up and caught his eye. For the first time, she didn't look away. She didn't look at him like he was a CEO or a stranger. She looked at him with that terrifying, analytical curiosity. She stood up, clutching her sketchbook, and walked toward the bench. "Minho-si," she said, her voice small but steady. "It's time for the ice cream. The shop gets crowded after 4, and I don't like the noise of the crowd. We have to go now." Jian stood up, her eyes fixed on Minho's phone. She knew what was on that screen. She knew what was at stake. This was the ultimate test. "Go ahead, Minho," Jian said, her voice devoid of judgment, only a tired sort of certainty. "The car is waiting. The world is waiting. Suman and I are used to the silence." Minho felt the weight of the phone in his hand. It felt like a lead weight. It felt like the 4-carat diamond. It felt like a cage. He looked at Suman. "What kind of ice cream did you say they have?" "Chocolate," the girl said. "But it has to be in a cup. Cones are too messy, and the drips change the weight of the ice cream." Minho looked at his phone one last time. The screen flashed. Incoming call. Park Sun-hyuk. With a slow, deliberate motion, Minho didn't just silence the call. He pressed the power button and held it until the screen went black. He tucked the phone into the pocket of his $6,000 jacket and left the jacket sitting on the bench. "A cup it is," Minho said, standing up. "I've never liked the mess either." Jian's jaw dropped. For the first time in the jewelry store, the park, and their entire shared history, she looked genuinely shocked. The professional mask didn't just crack, it shattered. "Minho, what are you doing?" she whispered. "That's your life on that phone." Minho reached out. He didn't touch her, he knew he hadn't earned that yet, but he stood close enough to feel the heat of the soil again. "No," Minho said, looking at Suman as she started walking toward the park exit. "That was just the architecture. I think it's time I actually moved into the house." He started walking. He didn't look back at the jacket. He didn't look back at the car. He followed the small girl with the analytical mind and the mother with the charcoal-stained soul into the humid afternoon air. Behind them, the phone on the bench vibrated one last time, a frantic, buzzing insect in the vast, uncaring silence of the park, before it finally went still. The merger was dying. The force of nature was dissipating. And for the first time in 12 years, Minho Park was exactly where he was supposed to be. If you were in his shoes, and your brother, or in this case, your father and your entire legacy demanded you choose between a billion-dollar empire and a chocolate ice cream with a daughter who doesn't even know your name, what would you do? Comment empire or daughter below. Be honest. The cost of the life is never cheap. The systematic dismantling of Minho Park began not with a press release, but with the clink of a single ice cube against crystal. 3 hours after the ice cream shop, Minho stood in the private study of his father's estate. The room was a tomb of dark mahogany and blue blood expectations. The air was thick with the scent of his father's expensive pipe tobacco and the heavy, suffocating weight of 3 generations of Park family pride. His father, Park Sun-hyuk, sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from the prow of a pirate ship. He didn't look up. He was staring at a tablet screen displaying the disastrous final hour of the stock market. "The merger is dead," Sun-hyuk said. The words weren't spoken. They were exhaled like poison. "The Han family has withdrawn. They cited a lack of discipline in our leadership. Our stock is down 12% in after-hours trading. The C-suite is in a state of mutiny. And you were at a playground." Minho stood in the center of the room. He had never felt more solid. "I wasn't at a playground, father. I was at an awakening. You are a failure," his father hissed, finally looking up. His eyes were cold, mechanical, the eyes of the machine. "You have thrown away an empire for a woman who was a mistake 12 years ago and a child who will only be a liability to your reputation." Minho walked toward the desk. He didn't move like an employee anymore. He moved like a man who had already seen the end of the world and realized it was just a beginning. "The mistake wasn't Jian," Minho said, his voice a steady, rhythmic pulse. "The mistake was believing that your conglomerate soul was the only way to exist. You taught me that life is a game of acquisitions. Well, I've decided to divest. I'm resigning, effective immediately. I've already sent the letter to the board." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a vacuum. "You will have nothing," Sun-hyuk whispered. "I will strip your name from the buildings. I will ensure every venture capital shark from here to New York knows you are toxic. You'll be back in that Mapo-gu gutter within a month." Minho smiled. It wasn't the sharp, predatory smile of a CEO. It was the calm, terrifying smile of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I've spent 12 years building cages, father. I'm looking forward to the gutter. At least the rain there is real." He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back at the mahogany or the tobacco smoke. He went straight to the penthouse, where Ji-won Han was waiting. The perfect asset was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her silhouette a sharp line against the neon grid of the city. She looked at the velvet box on the table, the ring he had finally bought, not because he wanted it, but because he needed to hand it back. "I heard about the board meeting," she said. Her voice was like silk over steel. "My father is furious. He says you've lost your mind." "I haven't lost it, Ji-won," Minho said, sliding the box across the marble toward her. "I've just found where I left it. You're a remarkable woman, but you deserve a man who sees you as a person, not a partnership, and I deserve a life where I don't have to check the Nikkei before I check my heart." Ji-won looked at the ring, then back at him. For a split second, the asset mask slipped, and he saw a flicker of envy in her eyes. "You're actually going to do it. You're going to just stop. "I'm going to start," Minho said. The studio was small, located in a refurbished warehouse near the Han River. It didn't have a marble floor or a filtered HVAC system. The windows were drafty, and the air smelled of turpentine, linseed oil, and the faint, sweet scent of ginger tea. Minho sat on a low wooden stool. He wasn't wearing an Italian suit. He was wearing a faded navy sweatshirt and jeans with a smudge of yellow ochre on the knee. He looked younger. The lines of paranoia around his eyes had been replaced by the fine lines of concentration. Beside him sat Suman. They were both staring at a single piece of charcoal-toned paper. Suman was teaching him how to draw shadows. "You're holding the pencil too tight, Minho see," she said, her voice serious and analytical. "If you hold it like a weapon, the line will be sharp. Shadows aren't sharp. They are soft. They are secrets, the light tells the ground." Minho loosened his grip. He felt the weight of the wood in his hand. It was lighter than a boardroom gavel, yet it felt more significant. "Like this?" he asked, tracing a soft, gray curve. Suman tilted her head 30 degrees. She tapped her pencil against her chin, the exact habit they both shared. "Better. Now you have to see the negative space. Don't look at the tree. Look at the air around the tree." From the back of the studio, Jian watched them. She was working on a canvas of her own, a massive, swirling piece that captured the movement of a monsoon rain. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence in the studio was comfortable now. It was the soil. Minho looked up from his sketch and caught Jian's eye. There was no conglomerate soul between them anymore, just the truth. He wasn't a billionaire. He was a consultant for small tech startups now, working 20 hours a week and spending the rest of his time learning the geography of his daughter's mind. He was broken in the eyes of the Gangnam elite. He was a cautionary tale for the ambitious. He was exactly who he wanted to be. The sun began to set over the Han River, the light filtering through the city smog in a specific, bruised purple and gold. It looked like a painting Jian would have made in their first year of marriage. Minho stood on the small balcony of the studio, a cup of tea in his hand. He watched the cars on the bridge, hundreds of little lights rushing toward their next meeting, their next deal, their next architecture of ambition. He felt a momentary pang of ghost pain, the phantom limb of his old life. But then, he heard the scritch, scritch, scritch of a pencil from inside. He heard Suman's quiet laugh as she corrected her mother's perspective. He looked down at his hands. They were stained with charcoal. His fingernails weren't perfectly manicured anymore. They were the hands of a worker. He took a sip of the tea. It was warm. It was real. The camera pulls back, moving away from the warehouse, rising above the Han River. The city of Seoul begins to glow. A sprawling, neon machine built on the sacrifice of 1,000,000 souls, but in one small, dim window in a forgotten corner of the riverbank. The light isn't neon. It's the warm, flickering yellow of a life being rebuilt from the soil up. The frame fades to a deep, noir black. The moral. In the end, Minho Park realized that success is the most dangerous drug in the world. It convinces you that you are building a future, while it systematically steals your present. True wealth isn't the 4-carat diamond in the velvet box. It's the charcoal smudge on a child's cheek and the courage to turn off the phone when the world is calling. Where are you watching from? What is the weather like outside your window right now? Does it feel like a storm, or is it the kind of day where you can finally see the negative space?